After the collections of EA and Bethesda games getting FPS Boost support on Xbox, Microsoft's May update adds a whopping 74 games to the list. It's a huge collection and honestly complete overload for us at Digital Foundry to check every box here. Today we're picking select highlights, our personal top picks from the 74, where we feel FPS Boost has the best effect, the biggest impact. This batch of games comes from pretty much every major publisher going. Assassin's Creed and Far Cry from Ubisoft obviously, Yakuza 6 from Sega, Metro 2033 Redux from THQ, Paladins, Homefront, the list goes on. The basic idea of FPS Boost works for all 74. 30 frames per second games on last gen are transformed to 60 FPS on Series X, with most also appearing on Series S, barring a few exceptions. Meanwhile, for games that already run at 60 FPS, Series X and S can push for 120 FPS experiences. So to help with this gargantuan task and offer some personal highlights from the list, I've invited DF's big boss, Rich Leadbetter. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Fantastic. Yeah, so we actually got access to this list a little bit ahead of the public release. I've spent a few weekends now playing FPS Boost titles. Very impressed overall, but I'm curious to see what you've got as your highlights here.
We really divided it up. I took on board 6 games that really took my eye, including Homefront, The Revolution, Gears 4, Yakuza, Anthem, some of the big ones. But yeah, I guess we should preface this by saying there is that catch with all these titles. Despite being supported, many of them won't have the FPS Boost checkbox enabled by default, and Microsoft does this by design because they want to keep, if there's 1x enhancements on a game, you can lose those by checking that box. In general, you lose something in exchange for this boost.
Yeah, this is an interesting one really, because it only seems to apply to Series X. And if FPS Boost is available but not enabled, then typically you're going to be getting the Xbox One S code path, meaning reduced resolution. And there's a pretty egregious example of that coming up. But let's get on with your games. Let's see what you dug up here.
Yeah, I really think Gears of War 4 is the absolute best example of it. This is my pick if you want like my favorite use of the FPS Boost feature from the bunch I've selected. There's a bit of a story to this game. Obviously there's the 1x enhanced version of it which runs on Series X by default, and even the splash screen when you boot it up has like that emblazoned across the front. So they're very proud of this, and that was obviously enabling a toggle in the menus which let you run the game at 1080p 60 for the campaign and horde mode, which translates to Series X of course, so 60 FPS was already in the game. So the FPS Boost mode really only removes that toggle and it removes the splash screen, and you just get the 60 FPS playback without much extra really. So it is essentially pointless for Series X owners. Multiplayer already ran at 60 FPS both ways, but you lose the option for 4K 30 with loads of visual enhancements. Textures, reflections, better draw distances, shadows and light shafts were all improved with that 1x enhanced patch. And that kind of gets reined in again with this mode enabled.
But this was your favourite FPS Boost title, and effectively it hobbles the Series X version. So what it must mean by sort of a process of elimination is that it does wonders for Series S.
Yes, absolutely. And this is really why. I mean, previously Series S just ran on the Xbox One code path, so no enhancements, no 60 FPS except for multiplayer. But now for the first time on Series S, you can actually play this game at 60 in the campaign and horde. So it's like absolutely rock solid as you'd expect. And it really just delivers on the promise. It's the ideal game for FPS Boost because it just taps into something that we know these machines can do, and just delivers it to us in a no frills sort of way. It runs at 1080p, 60 FPS on Series S, and I've had no drops whatsoever, so very, very pleased with this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is really good because effectively the Series S is quite a powerful little unit, but until FPS Boost came along, you would have been locked into the 1S version of the game, which was capped at 30. You wouldn't have had any of the love that the 1X version got. You still don't get the 4K 30 version, but what you do get is a really beautiful 1080p 60 game that just flies. And yeah, I agree entirely. This is like a game changer for Series S here. I'm kind of a bit bemused as to why the tick box is available at all for Series X.
Yeah, I know, right?
But yeah, I agree entirely. It is an absolute game changer for Series S and well worth checking out. And I suspect inevitably it's on Game Pass. So yeah, grab it.
Yeah. So I guess a second down the list for me is Anthem, which is in a way a complete opposite to Gears 4 in the way it's used, in that it is only enhanced with the FPS boost on Series X. Series S misses out with this one. You go from 30 FPS, which was the target for last gen, and you get 60 with this one. And I've got to say, it's just, there's, a running theme with a lot of the titles we'll be looking at today is there isn't much of a drop under 60 in a lot of these cases, and Anthem is a great example of that. It just flies through. Yeah, it's kind of a joy to see, because this game has a real focus on aerial maneuverability, which really benefits from that 60 hertz refresh. It feels so much slicker to play. Yeah, I wish there was more to say. Oh, of course, the resolution does take a hit with this. With FPS Boost engaged, you get an image closer to 900p, which suggests we're using the 1S code path here. I mean, even the text is 1080p when you drop it. So you lose your 4K DRS checkerboarded image without FPS Boost. That is the sacrifice, and it does to me explain why Series S was excluded from this mode, the 60 FPS support, because if this is the drop we're seeing that's necessary to make it happen, then, with all this alpha going on screen during this battle, I do wonder how it would have fared. But yeah, it's a real success. Series X only, of course, but yeah, really happy with this one.
Yeah, I'm a bit sort of bewildered as to the criteria of how a game gets support on Series X but not S. I mean, if you look at the multiplier of GPU performance for Series S, it's like 4 teraflops versus like 1.4 on 1S.
Yeah.
It should be able to do all of these games. And I'm kind of surprised that not all of them are supported. I'm just thinking memory bandwidth is quite constrained on Series S, and the 1S, of course, had the ES RAM, which I guess if you were fully tapping into it would be a bit of a bandwidth monster. But it is kind of a bit bizarre, and it's also a bit sort of weird. I think it's a bit difficult to choose between like 4K 30 and 900p 60. It's not a no-brainer. Do you know what I mean?
And that explains why it's disabled by default on Series X, this mode.
Yeah.
Yeah, not straightforward, but yeah, I know what you mean. I wouldn't feel comfortable either way. It feels like such a sharp cut, image quality wise, to get it, but it is there. I mean, it's a nice bonus to have. Okay, so the next on my list would be, this is where things are less clear cut in terms of it being an absolute success. I've gone for Homefront: The Revolution in third place here. It's off by default on Series X, and it makes sense since it runs again on the 1S code path, meaning it runs at a native 900p down from the 1800p you get with FPS Boost disabled. So quite a cut down, but I will say in terms of frame rate delivery, broadly speaking, this one's really good. So yeah, mostly 60, and obviously being a big open world CryEngine game, that's really impressive. It's great to see. But there are these unusual drops. You walk down the streets of a big city like this and it just tanks very suddenly and then restores 60. And we've got a few theories as to why this might be.
Possibly some sort of, I don't know, streaming stutter or VSync issue or something.
Yeah.
It looks odd.
Yeah, both those could be valid. Streaming definitely could be an issue with this one. Yeah, but otherwise, Series X really solid. Series S, on the other hand, I did have a lot more of an issue with. Same setup again, but obviously Series S is using the 1S code path, so you have 900p as the rendering resolution. But it does seem to drop a lot more. You know, walking down a city, you'll have spikes down to, it flatlines at the 50 FPS line and then jumps back up. Yeah, really strange, but it happens all over the city with a fair bit more regularity. Not even doing very much, just opening boxes. I think it must be a stutter or a streaming issue.
Right, so basically try it. If you find the stutters to be annoying, turn it off then.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that vein, I think we should turn to Yakuza 6, which is enabled by default on Series X because, well, there's no harm in doing it. It's absolutely does what it sets out to do. It's a great looking game. It actually had 1x enhancements, a very basic one in that it ran at 1080p, but it was a lift over the 1S at 900p. So what you get with FPS Boost enabled is just 1080p 60 on Series X, and it pretty much delivers. There's one or two stutters when you get into a battle, cutscene, camera changes, that sort of thing, but it's never too egregious, so I'm quite happy with this one.
Excellent.
Yeah. The troubles start with the Series S version though. I thought going into this it should be a slam dunk. It runs at 900p and 60 FPS, but then I noticed as you walk down the main streets, it drops with a sustained 55 FPS or so, and at that point I thought, well, less than ideal. Get into a battle and it drops even further, and you can have whole stretches of play running between 45 to 60. It's really not what I expected of this, and that's despite running at a lower resolution as well, 900p.
Interesting. Don't really have much to say about that, except I think the 1X was kind of hardly being pushed with this title.
Yeah.
It was exactly the same as PS4 Pro. There was literally no real difference between them. So the concept of doubling frame rate should be a walk in the park for Series X, and I'm glad to see that that's the case here, but kind of puzzled by what's going on with the Series S there.
Yeah, me too. I don't think it's a deal breaker, but I did expect it to lock on.
Yep.
Oh, I really should say, of all the improvements in going back to Yakuza at 30, felt the most glaring, so I would have this enabled at all times anyway, but
fair enough.
Yeah.
So next one, I guess it's got to be Metro Redux, surely.
Yeah, it's got to be. I did 2 120 FPS supported games, Metro 2033 Redux, which obviously pairs with Last Light as well, and also Paladins. I guess we can very quickly whip through these, despite the fact Metro is such an incredible game, especially for the time. It is a perfectly 120 FPS game all the way through on Series X and S. There's nothing to say whatsoever about this. It's just fluid, perfect 120 Hz feedback. I guess it makes some sense because it released for 360 PS3, and then we're looking at the Redux version, which had enhanced textures and effects laid over the top. But I think fundamentally, a lot of the areas were designed with slightly more limited level design in general. So it does seem to translate to 120 FPS perfectly. Really beautiful game even today. When it opens out, it really just looks gorgeous. And I've got nothing bad to say about it. It's just really, really well done.
Yeah, I'm really liking it. I really like the fact that quite a lot of first-person shooters are getting 120 Hz support. You really do feel the difference in the controller. So, the opportunity to play these games at 120 Hz is excellent. I guess that kind of leads us on to Paladins, really. Oh, but before we do talk about Paladins, just to confirm here, 120 Hz for Metro on both Series X and Series S, right?
Yes, Series X and Series S. Oh, and we should say the resolution on this as well. It is 912p, which a bit of a hangover from the early Xbox One days, where they bumped it from 900p, I believe, because of the Kinect GPU reservation being freed up for developers back then. We got an extra 12p out of that bargain, so not too bad.
Brilliant. But yeah, Paladins.
Paladins, to wrap up my bunch. Actually, this is really well done. Absolutely no qualms. 120 again. A few small stutters, just out of the blue here, but nothing to worry about. Again, I think at 120 these drops are a bit overblown when you see them on a graph there. I did notice them on Series X, but not on Series S, but I wouldn't read too much into that, I don't think. Paladins on both Series X and S run natively to my eye at 1080p as well. But so far I haven't seen any real drops besides that one case. So yeah, very good. Really, really impressed by this bunch. But Gears 4 takes my pick as the best of the lot. So yeah, over to you, I guess, Rich. I mean, you've had a fair few more to test. I'm kind of staggered by how much you've got on your list here, but there's a lot of games which seem to gun for 60 FPS and completely nail it, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm going to start with one that doesn't quite do it, but you should definitely check it out nonetheless. In fact, I might well do a standalone video on this, because Shadow of the Tomb Raider on Xbox Series X is just phenomenal. 3584 by 2016 resolution, but has got really good temporal accumulation. To the eye, it's a 4K game, and you are running it at 60 frames per second for the vast majority of the experience. It's just pretty awesome. There are some drops, mostly usual suspects when there's a lot of transparency effects in play, and this kind of disaster water sequence here that you're seeing play out, that's pretty much the worst of it.
Oh yeah. I know the one.
But curiously, Series S, this also gets the enhancement and runs at 900p, and well, it's, to my eye, just flawless from start to finish. So yes, that same disaster sequence there where you're caught along in the torrent, that just runs at flat 60, whereas the Series X has a bit more of an issue there. But both versions, highly recommended. For my money, probably the best FPS Boost title I've seen so far, simply because it just looks phenomenal on the Series X. It really does. And it's similar to the experience you're getting on PlayStation 5 with the PS4 Pro titles that did run at 30 FPS or slightly lower, and they just run at 60 now. It's not quite as tight a lock, but man, it just looks so good and feels so good to play. Just as a quick aside there, Tomb Raider Definitive Edition, 1080p, that was a real disappointment back in the day on Xbox One.
Yeah.
And it was sort of capped 30, drops beneath, screen tearing. I only played this on Series S, and you don't need the extra horsepower of Series X. I just had locked 1080p 60 there. It's quite interesting to see how technology had advanced. I mean, the lighting looks pretty basic by today's standards, materials and whatnot, but the art quality still holds up, texture quality still holds up. It's well worth checking out. So yeah, Tomb Raider games, excellent. The next title I want to talk about, Assassin's Creed Unity.
Oh boy.
We've already done an extended video on this, and that was on Series X, and it required the disc version of the game, which originally didn't have a frame rate cap. So if you stopped the patch from updating the game, you could benefit from the unlocked frame rate. You could do it on Xbox One X, but you didn't get to 60 frames per second. But on Series consoles, Series X specifically, you could hit pretty much a locked 60 frames per second. And now you don't need the disc anymore. So Series S is invited to the party. And what we're seeing here is basically the classic benchmarking sequence that we use on the PC version of the game. And it's quite interesting to see that the depth of field effect that just nerfs AMD GPUs. I mean, it's been the bane of AMD GPUs up until Navi came along, but it's still present here on Series S. That was sort of a bit of a point of amusement for me. But otherwise, beyond depth of field effects in cutscenes, this game is locked at 900p 60 on both. And yes, it's 900p. Yes, you've got 12 teraflops on Series X. Yes, your system is being horrendously underutilized. But the game really is good. It's, you know, John calls it the last of the proper Assassin's Creeds. They definitely rejigged the formula. They took it in new directions.
Yes, yeah, for sure. I really felt this was a revolution for the series, and I will say also, having it patched as well, on top of being able to run it at 60 rather than, you know, using the disc without the patch, must come with some benefits, right? Is it more fluid than a disc unpatched?
Not really. You just have all of the bug fixes that are kind of useful to have. So it's a bit more of a stable experience. But, you know, I noted a tweet by Phil Spencer where he was playing co-op in that game, and it just reminded me that when Unity came along, Ubisoft was super ambitious for the series. They were going to push it in new directions. And co-op play for Assassin's Creed, multiplayer, I think it's still a really awesome idea, but it never progressed beyond Unity. So being able to play it It's kind of like a taste of what might have been. But I do highly recommend checking this one out. Oh, I should say before I move on that almost all of the old Assassin's Creed games now run at 60 thanks to FPS Boost. The Ezio Collection, Rogue, Assassin's Creed 3 Remaster, all of 60 frames per second. I guess the outliers would be Black Flag. I'm not sure that's in the lineup. And also, funnily enough, Assassin's Creed 1, which did get a 1x enhancement to take the 360 code up to 4K. That's what you'll get on Series X, but so far, no 60 frames per second. So, yeah, but that was just phenomenal. I mean, I did play a lot of games here. I guess the next one, I'm going to talk about it quite briefly. Eidos Montreal. They did a superb game, Deus Ex Mankind Divided. Awesome immersive sim. And it was a bit disappointing on Xbox One, and it never received a 1X patch. Performance was really dodgy, lots of tearing, lots of performance drops. I played it on Series S, and it's basically just 60 frames per second from start to finish, even when you've got a face full of alpha effects, which tend to cause problems. This just flies through it, and this is a really good opportunity to replay the game at a really super smooth frame rate.
I wonder if any of these games that we're looking at where 60 is just pretty much locked, that they could have been a bit more ambitious maybe, especially ones where there's Series X and S have the same target, Mankind Divided is like one of those where I think it's the aesthetic is simple enough, it's a sci-fi setting where...
Well, you say that, but they did try to up the resolution on PS4 Pro, and there were some performance issues as a consequence of that. So I do think it was quite a challenging game, and I'm just really happy to play it at 60 frames per second. But yes, it came in that weird period where the Pro was out, but 1X wasn't out. So there was never a 1X patch for it. So there's no route forward there for Series X to do anything more than 900p. But regardless, I'm really disappointed that we don't have more Deus Ex titles. But, you can go back and enjoy this one. And it's awesome. So moving on, I want to talk about Far Cry 5. This is a bit of an interesting one. First of all, Series S. It is 1440 by 1080. 60 frames per second is pretty much locked from start to finish. You can play this game, and it is definitely a huge improvement over the non-FPS Boost version, which would have been tapping into the 1S code path. You'd have got that 1440 by 1080p resolution. So yeah, for Series S, this is actually a really good upgrade, and the performance is essentially locked. I think VG Tech, the YouTube channel that we all enjoy, they played a bit further into it than I did. It seems that there's a tiny little bit of stutter when you're flying. I didn't get to a plane, but all I can say is that every attempt I had beyond that to try and cause performance issues for this game, nothing happened. It was just a flat 60 frames per second.
Wow.
And therefore, moving on to Series X, it's effectively identical. It's the same thing. The problem being that to ensure that consistency, they have opted for the 1S code path. And you do need to manually set FPS Boost. But yeah, you're dropping down from a native 4K to that 1440p by 1080 resolution. So yeah, it's a really difficult choice here. Do you go for 60 frames per second, or do you retain the beautiful 4K presentation of this game? And it is really difficult to choose between them. One looks a lot better, one plays a lot better. But there's no knockout blow there, not in the way that there is with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where you just you had the best of both worlds there. And I think that's kind of what people were expecting from FPS Boost on Series X.
Yeah, to me it sounds like Series S really hits the sweet spot in terms of what you'd expect versus what we're getting with Far Cry especially. Yeah, bit of a shame. That definitely feels like the better balance, and Series X is left wanting all that untapped power. It's quite staggering.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious as to why it wasn't possible. I'm sure that you could have got a really good experience if you had a VRR screen, even if it wasn't a locked 60 frames per second. I guess we just don't really know. All I can really say is that Microsoft do really thoroughly validate these games, and there must be some kind of bar that a game needs to hit in order to get FPS Boost enabled. And I suspect that the bar is probably higher on Series X than it is on Series S based on the testing we've seen so far. I mean, Yakuza is a pretty big example of that, I think.
Yeah, I would agree.
But moving on, let's talk about Mad Max, because this is a game from Avalanche, the creators of Just Cause. Never really set the world on fire when it came out, but I actually had a really good time playing this back in the day. It's one of these games where it did actually target native 1080p on Xbox One. It was very, very close to PlayStation 4 back in the day, in an era where the One was really having big comparison issues versus PS4. This was a really good, very, very close comparison between the two systems. Series S just runs at 60 frames per second. A game that was pretty well optimized for Xbox One actually translates into a pretty rock solid 60 frames per second. Now, there was no 1x enhancement for this, but the compatibility team have done something really clever here. Instead of doubling frame rate for Series X, they've quadrupled it.
Wow.
So, yeah. So a 30 FPS game on Xbox One becomes a 120 frames per second experience on Xbox Series X. It is 1080p, so I'm kind of reminded of like Super Lucky's Tale there, which did something quite similar in the first bunch of FPS Boost titles.
Looking at it, it seems like a few Lego games have also done the same thing. Marvel's Avengers, a couple of them, The Hobbit, the sort of 120 hertz versus 60 hertz FPS Boost difference.
I haven't actually checked out those games, but the Lego series did actually start out as a 60 hertz experience on PS2, kind of dropped back to 30 towards the sort of mid to tail end of 360 and kind of stayed there. So it's nice to see it back to 60 there for the Lego titles. Where should I move next? Dying Light. I had to check this out. Now, this is a game that, again, only appeared on Xbox One. There was no 1X enhancement for it, so you are limited to 1440 by 1080. But curiously, there is no Series S FPS boost for this one. It's locked at the same resolution, but at 30 frames per second. Series X, though, locked 60. And I'm kind of reminded of, I mean, this game came out in 2015? I'm reminded of just how forward-looking Techland's engine was, the Chrome engine, I believe it's called. But this is a massive, sprawling open world here. Enormous vistas. And when you're down at ground level, the screen can be packed with zombies. And there's so much going on here. And I think I said in the DF Direct last week that I would happily take a remaster of this with a higher resolution than 60 frames per second. Maybe an update to anti-aliasing and lighting, which is a bit dated.
We've come a long way, yeah.
Yeah, but everything else about this game is just brilliant. And man, replaying it on FPS Boost has been a delight because it's just a brilliant, brilliant game. Yeah, performance is just flawless pretty much, as you'd expect for, a game that originally targeted, a 1.4 teraflop machine. It's now got 12 teraflops of GPU compute, big throwing at the problem. But, if you've got this one in your library and you've got a Series X, I think you've really got to check this one out. Final game I'm going to be looking at here, not exactly ending on a high note, but again, it kind of highlights how far we've come across the generation. So back in the day, Watch Dogs 2012, the classic E3 trailer, it didn't quite pan out exactly along those lines. It didn't quite get that enormously fantastic next generation experience. And Xbox One actually got, I'd say, a pretty middling version of the game, the classic 792p. Do you remember that?
I remember that very vividly, yeah. People were so up in arms about that.
Well, back in the day, there was a lot of 720p titles for Xbox One, and they were running at like 900 or 1080 on PS4. Big gap there. And there's this kind of weird in-betweener phase where we hadn't quite reached 900p on a lot of Xbox One titles, which kind of became the standard pre-DRS. And we got 792p instead. But all I can really say is that Watch Dogs It is a perfectly locked 60 frames per second. I tested it on Series S. It will run on Series X pretty much identically, I'd expect. Interesting ideas conceptually, but in terms of the rendering, in terms of the city simulation, in terms of the characters, it's a world apart from other open world titles that arrived during the generation. And even the Watch Dogs sequels were so much better. But it is a historical artifact, and it never ran particularly well on Xbox One. So, if you want to go back and revisit it, it is now 60 frames per second locked. But yeah, that's it.
Brilliant.
Well, yeah, brilliant. I mean, it's acceptable, but certainly not that fantastic. It beats the Wii U version, though.
Yeah, but then a lot does. Anything else? Did you look at Hollow Knight as a bonus, or?
I did look at it, and essentially it's 120 frames per second. And
no surprises.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a great example of how the platform genre benefits so much from 120 hertz. It just looks super smooth. 74 games, I mean, we haven't covered them all, but it certainly feels like it.
We've been going on for a while. I mean, yeah, this should turn into a long video.
Absolutely. But that's it. I mean, I think it's a really good initiative. It's really fantastic to revisit the old games. There's a sense almost that the last generation still got a lot to offer, hasn't quite been superseded by the new wave of games yet. And FPS Boost just allows you to access those older titles and play them in a much better, a much smoother way that does actually exercise the new machines. And there's a lot of love here for both Series S and X.
I agree. I guess we'll leave it there. A shout out to the games we didn't have time for. Obviously, Lego games are 120 hertz now on Series X, and there was Alien Isolation, Sleeping Dogs at 60 hertz. Just so many. But that's all for today. Thanks so much, Rich, for your help on this one.
Absolutely.
If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell to get notifications as any new video lands. We have this video and many more on our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and many other bonuses too. And also, if you want to get in touch with myself or Rich or the rest of the team, you can do exactly that via Twitter. But from the both of us for now, thanks for watching.